Okay, we're ready. So, welcome to my talk, Performance Improvements for an Enterprise Scale Website. And what do we have planned for today? So, usually, when you look at performance improvements, you're looking at a very specific problem, right? Maybe you have a caching problem, maybe you have a problem with your assets not loading correctly. But here I would like to go into a mode where we do some kind of storytelling, and I'm sharing what we learned when we were doing performance improvements for a very large website. And I hope through this storytelling you can pick up something and you can say, hey, I heard about this before, and maybe I can look a little bit deeper. Now, we'll get right into it after I introduce myself. So my name is Simon Bese, and I work for Factorial. Um, I started my working life, let's say, as a mathematician. So I was doing research for numerical analysis, really deep down. And then I took a turn when I founded a nonprofit with some of my friends, and I went into web development. And it was a platform where we were bringing together social organizations with volunteers. And this platform that we built was based on Drupal. Now, this is how my journey started with Drupal, and this is, a good chunk of 10 years ago. And you will see this slide again at the end, so maybe we can start a conversation. Now, if we look at the project, oftentimes it looks like this. Give me just 1 second. Maybe I can hide these controls here. Hide controls. Perfect. Now it's even bigger. So a project can look like this. And I guess many of you have been in a project like this. We have a time frame for feature development. And then just before the release, we do some optimization. Now, in many cases, this makes sense. So if you think of search engine optimization, if you don't have your nodes and you don't have your content, it's very hard to optimize, and you want to have the ground layer of your application first. Right? Now, with performance improvements, though, this can get crunch time, right? Because you want to release your website, but it's actually not working properly yet, and the release date is coming closer and closer. So it can be a burden on the developers to make this application deliverable. Right? Now, and then sometimes you also have projects where it looks like this. The application is released, and there is an optimization phase afterwards. But usually, if you have a scenario like this, your website or your developers will actually be in a burning mode, because let's just think of one example. You developed your application, everything is fine, but once you deploy it to the live infrastructure, it's not working anymore, because maybe the live environment is different than the local or your staging environment. And then if you have a scenario like this, it actually has an impact on the end users of your application. And I mean, I work in an agency and we work for clients. So if the client sees this has an impact on the end users, the complaints are coming back to you very quickly. So that's why there is a burning flame. And the next slide is one of the key takeaways for this talk. Usually, the larger the project gets, the more the optimization looks like this. So you do your feature development, and you always need to keep in mind that you have to do optimization, right? And also, for a large-scale project, the responsibilities are in different areas. So it's not only search engine optimization anymore, but maybe you have to take care of the infrastructure, or you actually have to think how is the architecture and how we're communicating with external services, and so on and so forth. Now, for the project that I want to talk about today, it looked quite similar, just a little bit different. Now, here what we're going to talk about, we had a big relaunch, and this is going to come up again, but the relaunch as a big project is also a good chance to do optimisations, right? And one more thing you see here is what I call the magic Christmas for this project, because as you know, towards the end of the year, the client communication is slowing down a little bit. Maybe you have some time to reflect, and finally you have some time without meetings, without refinements. And at least the last Christmas, for me, was very successful in regards to optimizations for this project. Now, when you think about this big bar on the top, of course, you not always know where you're going to go. So I always feel like there is a path you're walking along. Right? You're making a plan. Okay, I want to hike there at some point, but if I want to hike there, maybe I need something first, a walking stick or something like this. So to look at it from a overarching perspective, we're going to take the relaunch as an anchor point, and we're going to discuss what happened before, and then also what happened afterwards. And for me, when I go into this reflection, there are key steps, and they are lined out here. So for me, the first step for this project, you have to know we took it over from a different agency. There was a lot of legacy code, years of development with different maintainers. So it's very hard to work on this website, which grew organically. So the first thing when I joined the project is to introduce PHP Stan. And of course, PHP Stan is not a performance improvement in itself. It's a tool that you can use for static analysis of your code. So what does that mean? You actually have a code that runs through your project and uses, for example, the class interfaces or the variable types to see if the code makes sense. This is good for boosting the confidence of your developers. So you have confidence to move the code around, and what's most important from a project management perspective is that you're wasting less time on small value tasks. What is a small value task? You can imagine you have a bug on your website, and you have to bind some of your resources. So in this case, maybe a developer debugging the code for one day until they finally find the problem, and then maybe another half day to solve the problem. And in the end, it has no big impact on the end customer, right? So you rather do the other thing that we also saw in the timeline, which is feature development. Because when you have a new feature, you can deliver it to the client, and the end users of the client, they can benefit from it. Now, the second point with the relaunch was that we had the chance to work on the entity architecture and the data quality. And I said this before, usually you need a bigger project to actually think about this. Right? But if you get the chance to work on the entity architecture, you get the chance to work on a cornerstone of the foundation for your website. Right? And I mean, we've done a lot here. This website, you're not only thinking about the entity architecture within your application, but because this website is talking to many different services, you also have to orchestrate that. So think about there's information coming in from external service. How do we interpret this information? How do the entities contain information, and how are they processed later? So what I'm mentioning here is with a bigger project for entity architecture, you're not only looking inwards, but you also have to look to the outside. Then, the third big step for me, this is project terminology, but I call it the language country negotiation. And the next thing you need to know about this website is that we're using a CDN, so a content delivery network, and the CDN communicates with the origin server. Now, when you are orchestrating the origin server and the CDN, actually many things can go wrong. So the first thing we think about, who is responsible for caching what. Right? So usually you want to have the static response of your origin server, you put it on the CDN, but quickly the questions comes up, yeah, what happens if something changes on the origin server? How do we purge certain information on the CDN? And granted, we have very good solutions for that in the Drupal contrib space. So if you have a CDN provider and you want to implement mechanics like purging, then there's the purge module. But still, there can be problems. So in this case, the big problem that we had, to describe it in an abstract way, is when the request is coming in, we cannot say for certain what the response is. And this is a very bad scenario. Usually, when you want to orchestrate a CDN in an origin server, the request and the response should always be one-to-one. Maybe to connect it to an example, and this is also why language country negotiation is here. Let's say the user has a cookie, and your origin server response varies by this cookie. Now, this can work, but usually if you orchestrate this with a CDN, it gets very hard. Now, why I'm pointing this out here, in the end, it's just one module, right? But again, what's important, or what is important is that you want to solve big problems in your application that have a ripple effect for later improvements. So if we are not orchestrating the CDN and the origin server correctly, then probably on the origin server we cannot use the proper caching setup. Right? All of a sudden you have a lot of cache variations, and maybe you have to do a request to the origin server more often than you wanted to. Oh, wow. Okay, sorry. Huh. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, then also here we have PHP 8.1 and Drupal 10. And this will come up again with PHP 8.3 and Drupal 10.3. So first we're going to look a little bit from a different perspective. With PHP 8, here I just want to mention, again, this was a lot easier because we introduced PHP Stan first. Right? Because PHP Stan can actually support you to find deprecations in your code and then also give you a good analysis on which parts of the code you need to update. So again, making the code more maneuverable. Then for the first Drupal 10 upgrade, I want to mention that we actually made a mistake with this large application because we were not maintaining the dependencies well enough. So you can imagine we have this outdated platform where we're doing a lot of feature development, and all of a sudden there's the big bang. So I think after cleaning up, this project has 180 modules or something. So if you have to make the big step from Drupal 9 in that case to Drupal 10, it will bind a lot of your resources, and yeah, the experience for the developers just will not be that nice. So from this experience again, I learned it's a lot better to do frequent dependency updates. And what's also nice, you are getting all the upstream improvements, and we will look at this a little bit with the next steps. For example, from Drupal and as well PHP. When you attended the first session in this room today, you heard about the performance improvements in PHP as well. Now, this is the roadmap since the relaunch. Right? And we're going to take a look at the different steps. Let's see how far we get, because I haven't really planned the time, but at least we'll touch on some of them. And the first one is bootstrap improvements. And this might be something where you're asking, really? Are we supposed to do bootstrap improvements? Isn't this something that is very deep somehow in Drupal Core? And maybe something that we actually do in the underlying framework with Symfony. And then, yes, really. And this comes back to what we said before. If you have a lot of dependencies, things can go wrong. And if your bootstrap is slow, it can affect your whole application, right? Again, imagine you're getting a request to the origin server, the bootstrap is slow, then you will have a slow response on every request. Right? Now, of course, if you want to analyze your bootstrap, you need to have a good understanding of your application, and you need expertise within your team to solve a problem here. This is the first fact, and usually, if you have a problem with your bootstrap, there's two types of problems. So the one that I just described, everything is slow for everyone. Or the second one, there is a nerd in your team going in there and trying to find an improvement. Right? But for both, it's bad for the client communication because in the first case, they see, hey, there is a major problem with the whole platform and we need to solve it immediately. Again, dumpster fire. Or the second, if you have a nerd going in your code, it gets really hard to sell, right? Because you have to tell the client, hey, we have this very specific problem that we cannot explain to you, but we should do it. Right? Now, there's one more thing that might be a little bit easier and might be easier to sell, and this is the idea that we had for this website. Sometimes we just don't need the Drupal bootstrap. Right? So the bootstrap generally is quite expensive from a performance view. So if we don't need to bootstrap Drupal for all of the requests, then we can save a lot of time. I'll just pick out one example. So this is an e-commerce site, and the shopping basket is actually external service. And we want to fetch the basket count. Right? A very typical problem. Now, this was part of a bigger API, but we realized, okay, we can actually cut this out because when we're requesting the basket count, nothing happens on Drupal. And then just use a PHP script. Right? There were some other factors why we wanted to use the backend as a proxy, but in the end, it was just 200 milliseconds. And again, this is very easy to solve, little developer time, and also it's easy to communicate with your client because you can actually see that it's snappier in the front end. All right, now we're getting a little bit deeper into it. Service optimisations. And this is about analyzing how your application actually works. Usually for a large-scale project, of course, you have Drupal Core, you have a lot of modules, but then with the business requirements, you also have a lot of custom logic. And one of the tools that I found very useful is flame graphs. So probably if you have done performance analysis before, then you know the traces and the profiling. And you can take the same and bring it into this format, which is called flame graphs, and it visualizes very well what is taking long time in your custom code. Right? Of course, there is some learning curve because you have to, again, see how does Drupal work in itself, so you can identify, hey, this is part of the bootstrap. Here we're loading the config. Here we're starting to resolve some paths, for example, do some path processing, and here we're using one of our custom services. And then it makes it very easy to identify. Now, this is an actual screenshot that I took. And the problem here was that we're using paragraphs, and we need some information about the structure of the paragraphs. Right? So very easy, is this the first paragraph on the page? Right? And other things. Now, this can be just implementation error. But of course, there are also techniques that you can use to improve such a service. So in this case, using proper caching, and then especially for this problem, using a custom query instead of the entity type manager to load all the entities. And then maybe we needed 200 milliseconds on every origin request before, and afterwards it's not measurable anymore. So you eliminated one of the problems in your application. Now, these numbers are super vague. I just want to give you a sense of the scale. Of course, this depends on the hardware you're running and the environment you're running. Now here, I just want to make a little asterisk because there's a lot of movement also in the Drupal space. So if you're interested in performance analysis where you're actually looking at traces and you're trying to digest some numbers from that, you can take a look at Gander. For this project, we haven't used it though. Now, two more examples. This is actually where you're gaining experience and you're identifying some things that you should not do. Right? And I will just share two of the things that you should not do that we actually found in this project. And the first one I call the constructor anti-pattern. And this is when you do something very expensive in your constructor. I took a very extreme example here, but if you're a backend developer, sometimes it's very comfortable to put something into a property so you can use it throughout the class. Right? But if you do it in a too extreme way, so for example, you're requesting information from external service and you wanted to put it into a property in your constructor, this can go wrong. Right? Why can this go wrong? This can go wrong because you don't have to necessarily have to control when this class in this case or this object is initialized. So think about having a plugin manager, initializing a plugin. Yeah, you don't necessarily know what the plugin manager is doing and when it's doing it. Then the second that I want to show is what I call the innocent. Right? Sometimes you just have one line in your code and you think you're doing everything right? You're using a core service, you're using a method without any custom code, but then actually when you do the analysis, you find out, oh, this might be slow. Right? So maybe you have a junior developer in your team, and they're saying, I have this path, and I want to find out the route. There's the core service, the URL matcher. It has a method match. And this can go okay-ish for a small application, but all of a sudden, if you have 10,000 or 100,000 of paths, of course this gets slow because you always have to iterate over all of the paths to identify the route at the end. And then the second, I don't even remember, but what I recommend for yourself, this kind of the developer cheat sheet, and probably every developer has a cheat sheet, this is on my list, right? And maybe you can take these three things also on your list to find it in your project. Then, back to the PHP and the Drupal updates. Again, for me, this is mostly about the client communication that you have, because for a large project, it's an investment to stay close to the most recent versions of PHP or Drupal. Right? But here is something that we can communicate very easily. So, for example, in combination with Drupal, PHP 8.3 is 1.5 times faster than PHP 8.1 on the language level. Of course, it still depends on the application that's on top, but you can pull out the statistics and just show it to the client. Hey, if we do this, we get all the upstream benefits just from PHP, and your website will feel snappier naturally. Right? The same for a Drupal 10.3 upgrade. So this was not necessarily in 10.3, but we had a lot of performance improvements also in core since Drupal 10.0 until the recent version. So for example, PHP fibers support doing rendering. Right? We are doing the rendering in parallel, more or less. Then we have the new variation cache API. This generalizes the render cache. Then for forms, post requests are now render cached. We have a state service that uses a cache collector. And then a little bit pain with the last one, but the CSS and JavaScript aggregation are also in Core now. Now, maybe tone it down a little bit again and talk about reducing the payload. And here, we had a lot of problems with this website because the payload was quite large. The general idea is, if you're sending a lot of stuff over the line, it can be slow for your user in the end, especially for mobile users. And we had it in another talk here, I don't know, remember which one, that you were maybe somewhere where the internet connection is not that good. You want to look at the mobile version, and then it actually makes a difference if the payload is 500 kilobytes or just 100 kilobytes. And now, maybe one quick win, everyone can do that, is the HTML minify module. And just by installing this module, right, you can reduce your payload very easily. It's quite interesting how heavy nothing can be. So HTML minify just removes the spaces, it removes the comments, right? And then in this case, we had the home page, for example, going from 330 kilobytes to 260. But one of our problem pages was the product listing page, and here we were sending 3.5 MBs almost over the line, and just with the module, we could reduce it to 2.8. Now, this is a quick win, right? And there's other problems connected to this. For example, for the product listing page, we're using a lot of data attributes. Right? So having the backend communicate with the front end, we somehow need to deliver some information over the DOM. Right? This is not completely solved for this specific website, but at least you have to be aware of the problem. The same goes for the image processing. And there's actually a talk after this one where you can learn more about the image processing. But here, actually going through the whole website and ensuring that we're using responsive images and that we're using WebP properly, it can significantly reduce the payload. Then, connected to this, render improvements. And this is quite a feisty topic, especially for this project, because as I showed before, we had this large relaunch, and when we were introducing the new design, writing new components, we actually ran into a lot of trouble writing the integration between the backend and the front end. So you can imagine the front end is building new components, the backend is working on features, somehow we have to integrate them, and there's a lot of movement going on. So things can go wrong. Then, of course, the answer is having good test coverage and so on and so forth. But one of the points that I want to pick out is that we have to be aware of the rendering process. Now, oftentimes, and what we saw in this code base is that we do premature rendering. So you can imagine you have a backend service and they're calling the render service, and you're rendering something in the backend and passing it on to the front end. Now, this can work, but oftentimes you're running into trouble, for example, with the caching and the translations, and this ultimately can have an impact on performance again. The same goes for overdue modeling. That's how I call it. So you can imagine you're going from the backend to the front end, and then the front end is actually doing backend tasks. Oftentimes you have something like this when you are going to the Twig template, and I don't know, you may be using field value or something in your Twig template. If you look at it on the top view, you're executing backend tasks in your front end. Again, this is the theory, but you're running into caching problems, translation problems, revision problems, and so on and so forth. So if you are able to solve this core problem, it will have a ripple down effect, so you can cache more properly. All right, here we actually have some examples why this was so hard for this website, and this is cache variations. So all the topics we talked about before are coming back now. if you have less cache variations, then it's easier to orchestrate your CDN because you don't have to call the origin server that often. And if you solve the integration, then it's a lot easier to communicate with the front end and rendering it out. So let's take this example. Here we have the header of this website, and from a front-end perspective, there's many components, right? You have this little teaser image, then you have a little tile, and the tile is sitting in a slider, and the slider is somehow part of a sub-menu, and then there's a bigger menu on top, right? And you're getting potentially a lot of variations and cache dependencies here. Now, why I'm pointing this out is, again, awareness. Right? You should know how much our content varies. And I'm picking a simple example here, so this is easier to see. So this is the footer, and in green, you see things that do not vary much. Right? So if you think about the whole container probably never changes. Right? Then maybe the menu in the middle, it changes a little bit, because it depends on the menu structure itself, but it also depends on the language. And then you have things that may vary a lot. Right? So here we have the language switcher, and also behind this international, there's a country switcher hidden. And if you have this awareness, then it's a lot easier to write your integration properly. Now, one thing that I liked about this is that we found a patch, and this is very specific, but maybe you can keep it in the back of your mind, and that the blocks are not rendered in the region. So what that means, for the green box around, we can call it a region, and in the region template, we still have the chance to place the blocks. We could go down this rabbit hole, but this is not what this talk is about. So what did that have, or what was the implication for this website? So the problem was, because there were so many variations, just look at the many little boxes here, they're all red, and maybe this is after the cleanup, we were actually flooding the caching server. So you can imagine we have in-memory caching, a Redis service there, and we're trying to store things in this cache. But there is physical limitations. And maybe you have 4 gigabytes of RAM on your Redis instance, and these 4 gigabytes could be full at some point. And I think this is the next slide. Yeah. And we made some changes to improve this. Again, it's a connected. Right? First, you have to lower the variations, but then you can also make changes on the infrastructure level. So here we went and increased the size for the Redis cache. And then also technical details, for example, how do you purge the cache in your Redis server? Let's not go into this. Essentially, the idea is my cache is full, which item do I purge first? And before we had a setup where we're just purging the oldest, but in a Drupal sense, this is not the best approach. And now we're following a purge policy where we're purging the least frequently used item. Best example, actually when you're doing the bootstrap, again with Drupal, some things are put into the cache, right? Now, if they were purged, you have to recalculate it. But if you keep them, and they're very frequently used, namely with every request, you don't need to recalculate it. Then again, also improvements on the content delivery network. This is mostly about orchestrating the origin server and the CDN. So Drupal has good solutions for that. Maybe one module that we can point out, it's the HTTP caching headers, control headers. I don't know exactly the module name, but you can actually share the responsibilities of how long certain things should be cached where. And then, here also quite interesting, in this orchestration, you can do a lot of things on the edge. This is connecting to the language country negotiation, the problem that we solved before. Now we're in a position where we can do redirects on the edge. Right? Imagine someone is coming in from a certain market, then you can negotiate the market on the edge and redirect the user directly on the edge, which is a lot faster than bootstrapping Drupal, doing some redirects, and sending the user somewhere else. Right? Then one of the last ideas is cache warming. And the message here is there's strong solutions in the Drupal contrib space. So you can look for the cache warmer, and it has certain submodules, and this works very well. For example, you can just take your sitemap, throw it in there, and fire requests on your origin server to fill the CDN with the most updated information. Of course, there needs to be some work. In our case, it was mostly about how does the website behave after deployment. Again, the scenario, there's a lot of movement in the code base, there's a lot of new features coming in. We want to do frequent deployments, but at the same time, our caches should be warm. So you can have a setup where you do the deployment and fire the cache warming also in the pipeline. And of course, there's more. This is actually the slide from the client presentation when I present this to them. And we always had the notion of the cherries on top. Right? And of course, there's more. For example, optimize path fallback handling. This is, again, when we were doing the service optimizations, actually looking deep into the application. Then storing resources locally. Again, sometimes you don't always have to request from an external service. You can just update it periodically. Then improve configuration of the front-end libraries, maybe very specific, but this was mostly solving problems with the integration. Improved static caching in class properties. This is probably one of the techniques most advanced backend developers will know. Removed multiple dependencies. This was with the Drupal 10 upgrade, where we actually threw out a lot of the dependencies and cleaned up our dependency tree. Let's just skip through. Improve the rendering of the admin toolbar, GitLab CI pipeline improvements, and then having an origin URL, nice. More memory for the CLI PHP processes. This is particularly important for this website because, again, we're doing a lot of constant migration where we're talking to external services. And then better timeout handling on the origin server. This is going back to how you orchestrate the CDN with the origin server. In this case, sometimes the origin server was so slow that the CDN said, no, this is not available, and it's just timing out, right? Okay. So let's talk about the key takeaways. And for larger projects, performance improvements are running constantly. This is, for me, the most important thing that you should remember about this talk. So just a bar of feature development and having constant awareness of that we have to do optimizations. Then the second, solve the important performance problems that cause a ripple effect for lasting improvements. This was the example of language country negotiation. We solved this problem, and then we could actually work on improving the caching for the website. There are many low-hanging fruit with the support of strong contrib modules. I mean, we're all here and we're all Drupal fans, but we have to say it more often, right? We have such a good content management system with such a vast contrib space, and there are many things that you more or less can get for free. And then the fourth key takeaway, we haven't really talked about this, but I just want to throw it in the room for you. The cycle is always, you should sell it, you should measure it, improve it, measure again, deliver it. Then sell it, measure, improve, measure, deliver. Right? This is mostly about the client communication. You can have the biggest nerd on your team, If you don't have any numbers, it will be very hard to communicate with the client and then make them aware of what is actually happening on your website. All right, that's me again. You can find me with Simon Bese almost everywhere. Probably the easiest is to write an email. Drupal Slack is also okay. And then if you're interested, please visit Factoria.io. This is where I work. And then also I have a personal blog where you can go. And there's actually a pretty long article also to this topic with more details. So if you're not sick of it yet, then you can read even more. All right, that's it.